Well, thank you, Mrs. Reardon, and it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairpersonship this afternoon, and I'm delighted and dismayed in equal amounts, really, to have this opportunity to lead a debate on food banks in Wales. And I have to say, it's a topic that I never thought, when I entered public life as a Cardiff councillor a long time ago in 1991, that I'd feel would become a priority need to discuss. In other words, that I'd ever see in my time in public life, the rapid expansion of centres to hand out food to the people of Wales on a scale really that's unprecedented since the 1930s. And of course, we from Wales have particularly bitter memories, particularly strong and often bitter memories of the 1930s and of poverty. It was often said of my own grandmother, Gwenllian Evans, who was a miner's wife from Nantiglow, that she could spread an egg over Cardiff Arms Park. Such were her culinary skills at making a little go a very long way. But my mother, who's still alive today and living in Cumbran, has often told me of the poverty that she grew up in the 1930s in Nantiglow and the times when it was a real struggle to feed the family. And it's for reasons like this, Mrs. Reardon, that I believe that I will in a moment. I'm just warming up a second. Once I've got into my stride, I'll let him have a go. It's for reasons like this, Mrs. Reardon, that I believe the provision of social security is such a strong theme in the history of Welsh politics, and why the rapid speed of the increase in food banks in Wales is particularly hard for us in Wales to take. And I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
David T.C.
I'm very grateful
David.
to the honourable gentleman for the history lesson as to what life was like under Ramsay MacDonald in the 1930s. But coming back to the present, perhaps he could tell us, given his interest in food banks, why was it no Labour members of Parliament asked any questions about food banks during the entire period of the last Labour government?
Kevin Brennan.
Such a minuscule feature on the scene, Mrs. Reardon, compared with what we see today, despite the Prime Minister's erroneous use of statistics recently at Prime Minister's questions in an attempt to sidestep his own failure to take note of the rise of food banks over a long period of time. And, of course, the reason why it's particularly apt to talk about the 1930s is because we are now reliving the 1930s with the austerity economics, the failures and the false theories behind austerity economics are being repeated. We might expect that from the Conservatives, but it is staggering that it's being also repeated in coalition by the party of John Maynard Keynes through the approach they're taking to the economy. I will give way.
Carl Williams.
For the honourable gentleman, he would concede, however, that income inequality did in fact grow under the previous Labour governments, as the previous Conservative governments as well.
Well, he'll be
Kevin
aware
Brennan.
of the powerful world economic forces that were at work in the last 20 years, which it's almost been like, King Canute trying to hold back the forces of international capitalism over the last 20 years in relation to trying to keep income inequality down. But the last Labour government did more than possibly almost any other Labour government to attempt to alleviate that, including through the introduction of things like the national minimum wage, which made a massive contribution towards trying to alleviate the impact of income inequality, which in a globalised capitalist system is very difficult, as he'll realise, to resist. I will.
But isn't the
Ian
essential,
Lucas.
I'm grateful to my honourable friends for giving way, but isn't the essential point that, as an example, Wrexham's food bank was set up last year for the first time since I've been in Parliament in 2001. This April, the richest people in Britain are getting a tax cut because of the policies of this coalition government. And that is the type of ethical approach that we have from this government.
Kevin Brennan.
Yes, indeed. I'm sure other honourable members will want to point out the fact that the government saw as its priority to lower the income tax of the richest whilst this particular crisis is going on. I will in a moment, but I'm going to get into my stride a little bit further before I let him have another go. And it's no coincidence, after all, Mrs. Reardon, that the three giants of the creation of what became known as the welfare state came from Wales, in the form of David Lloyd George, Jim Griffiths and Aneurin Bevan. And indeed, it's particularly ironic that it is a government, including members of the successor party to Lloyd George's Liberals, that it's presiding over a policy that's helping to trigger the rapid expansion of food poverty and food charity for the poor. And I note from a sedentary position, the honourable gentleman calls into question whether or not they're the successor party, and that's another debate for another day, I think, Mrs. Reardon. But perhaps Lib Dem members of this government should recall the words of David Lloyd George when we're debating food banks and poverty in presenting his People's Budget 104 years ago in 1909, when he said, and I quote, this, and then there's an ellipse for the Hansard writers, is a war budget. It's for raising money to wage implacable warfare against poverty. You can put another ellipse in there. I cannot help hoping and believing that before this generation has passed away, we shall have advanced a great step towards that good time when poverty and wretchedness and human degradation, which always follows in its camp, will be as remote to the people of this country as the wolves which once infested its forests. Well, I'm afraid, Mrs. Reardon, that under this government, the wolves of poverty are back, along with the sharks who prey on the financial misfortunes of the poor with their high-rate loans. I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm very grateful. Can I ask him to comment on a particular feature of the Neath Food Bank, which is that around half those, 1,400 by the way, 1,400 people in the Neath area are dependent on food from the food bank. Around half are actually in work. And this is not a question of people on benefits alone dependent on the food bank, it's people in work. And the Wales Office website has still not taken down the Secretary of State's commitment that people in work will always be better off than they would be on benefits. They're dependent on food banks in my constituency.
Kevin Brennan.
Yes, indeed. And I noticed in a recent debate, my friend from Cardiff South and Penarth, my honourable friend, in a debate that was led by my honourable friend, the member for Liverpool Wavertree, to get it right, did mention about how he'd experienced collecting food for fair share in Penarth, that many of the people that were being helped by the food bank there actually were not the people you might expect, but actually people in work but struggling to get by. And I note also that a food bank, since he's been keen to intervene so far on a couple of occasions, that a new food bank's opened up in Chepstow, and I'm sure the honourable gentleman will be paying it a visit shortly if he hasn't done so already. So for us in Wales, the rapid expansion of food banks resonates and rankles. It's symptomatic of an approach by the government that represents a shift away from the British belief in the importance of social security, founded by those three great Welsh pioneers and symbolised by the old age pension, national insurance and the NHS, and its replacement with an alien American concept of welfare stigmatism, the demonisation of the poor, and the replacement of the responsibility of the state with the vagaries of the charitable handout. The good society, Mrs. Reardon, gazumped by the ill-named big society, where well-meaning individuals try to patch the gaping holes created by the impact of austerity economics. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Simon
Very grateful to honourable gentleman giving way. And would it be just too much to ask, on this occasion, on such a serious issue, to steer away from the notion that all of this started in May 2010. Food banks in West Wales, one I'm actually a patron of, started in 2000 under a Labour government, and they are very keen to stress that this is actually a misleading argument which the honourable gentleman is pushing.
Well, I'm sure he wasn't accusing me of misleading the House, Mrs. Reardon, because you would have stamped on him if he had done so. But of course, I'm developing an argument, not that food banks in and of themselves are bad things, or indeed that the work they do is bad. It isn't bad. It is good, the work that they do. But what's wrong is the scale of the work that they are now having to do because of the austerity economics and the rise in the cost of living, and which are a direct result of the policies of this government, which is an ideological choice that this government took to follow an austerity economics policy rather than, I'm still speaking, follow an austerity economics policy rather than to take another economic choice, which they could have taken, namely to deal with the deficit in a way which wouldn't have had to lead to such poor growth and the consequences. I'll give way. I'll come back to him in a minute.
Howell Williams.
In fact, the honourable member will know is that 9 of the 23 food banks in Wales opened in the last 12 months.
Well, I think he's hit the nail on the
Kevin
head,
Brennan.
and that's what was so, shall we say, unfortunate about the Prime Minister's attempt to use statistical shenanigans to disguise the fact that the real issue is the scale of sheer numbers of people who are now having to go to food banks compared with the charitable aid that was on offer previously under the previous government, and indeed which is always going to be present in one way or another in our society, is to be welcomed. It's the scale of what's being done, not what is being done, that is most important. I'll give way to my honourable friend, then to the honourable gentleman, and then I'll come back to the honourable lady after I've trotted a few more arguments out.
Grant Davis.
I'm very grateful to the honourable friend. In Swansea, tons and tons of food are being gathered every month to the food bank, and thousands of people are affected. He will be aware that something like 30,000 people rely on food banks at the moment in Wales. What is his projection after April, when 40,000 people will be affected by the second bedroom tax? The least well off will be worse off again and will be relying on these food banks. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'm not going to make a projection, but I'm sure the Minister will want to, because of course he should be very, very concerned about the impact of these changes that the government is introducing. So he no doubt will have done a considerable amount of work on the very issue that my honourable friend is raising in his intervention, and will perhaps say something about it in his remarks at the end of the debate. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Simon Hart.
Second and last intervention, I think, which is just to ask the honourable gentleman to express a view on a comment made by this 17-year-old food bank in West Wales. Statistics are misleading as it takes time to build up referrals and to be known about. And they went on to say the huge increase in recent years should not be taken as being the same thing as a huge increase in need. Now, that's not my comments. It's the comments of a food bank. And I just wonder if the honourable gentleman will include those in the context of his argument.
Kevin Brennan.
It's other people who assess the need, obviously not the food bank itself. They just bring the vouchers are brought along to them. But I can't comment on his local food bank, and I'm sure he has a better knowledge of it than I have. I can comment on mine, however. And I've heard stories from other honourable members and seen the evidence from around the country. And I have to say that he's burying his head in the sand if he doesn't think that the vast expansion of food banks is happening because of the impact of some of the changes that are going on in relation to austerity economics, in relation to the welfare benefit changes, in relation to the cost of living. So we called this debate today, Mrs. Reardon, in order to try and set the record straight about the growing use of food banks in Wales and to highlight the cost of living crisis facing hundreds of thousands of Welsh families. And at this point, I will give way to my honourable friend.
Tiana Berger.
I'm here to listen to this debate because I have constituents that work in Wales, and I also have people from Wales that come and work in my constituency. And as was highlighted by my honourable friend, this issue is as much about people in work as people out of work. And does my honourable friend share my concern about the actual explosion of this issue? We know the growth of the figures of the number of food banks in Wales. Nationally, we know that there's been an increase of a couple of hundred of food banks that have opened across the country. And actually, by the end of April, across the country, 250,000 people in our country will have accessed emergency food aid. And doesn't he think that's a terrible indictment in 2013 in the 7th most industrialised nation of the world?
Well, I do, and I apologise in advance if I repeat some of those statistics later in my remarks. And I'd also pay tribute to the work that she's done in Liverpool, sometimes referred to wrongly as the capital of North Wales, but certainly with a very strong Welsh influence. But I do pay tribute to the work she's done. I recommend to honourable members opposite the YouTube video that she made showing the impact of food banks and the impact of the government's policies on people in her constituency, and it's something certainly worth viewing. Now, the number of people relying on food banks in Wales has trebled over the last year, rising from just over 10,000 to just under 30,000. That's the issue. It's the sheer scale of numbers, not the percentage increase. This number, as honourable members have said, is forecast to rise to 40,000 a year in the near future, in fact over the next 12 months. And the growth of food bank usage in Wales is twice that of the UK average, and that's something I think the Minister should have a think about. The growth is twice that of the UK average. But however, the government won't acknowledge that the growth in food bank usage is a problem. A Downing Street source recently said that food banks are for people, and I quote, who feel they need a bit of extra food. Now, let's just pause for a moment, Mrs. Reardon, and consider the casual callousness of that comment. Because, Mrs. Reardon, like many MPs, I now find myself, and I have to say I never thought I would when I entered public life, I now find myself the reluctant hander out of food vouchers to my constituents from my constituency office and surgeries. And I can assure Downing Street and the Prime Minister that not one of them has been issued to, nor indeed have I ever been approached by constituents who, and I repeat the quote, feel like they need an extra bit of food. They approach me because they're desperate, because they don't know, in a moment, because they don't know how they're going to feed their children this weekend. In short, because they're in a crisis and the state isn't there to provide them with immediate assistance. And I'll give way to my honourable friend.
James.
I'm sure that he, like me, when he hands out these food vouchers, finds that not everybody who comes to us is a malingerer or a scrounger. They're actually people who have had delayed benefit payments and are being denied the money that they need to help keep their families in food and in heating.
Well, she's absolutely right, of course, that in many cases the reason why people are unable to feed their families that weekend is because there is no benefit. They've fallen upon some crisis in their life and there isn't immediate assistance available, and they've been told they'll have to wait for some considerable time and they're unable to access a crisis loan of any kind. And that's why they come to us, members of Parliament, and we are handing out to them vouchers so they can get some food for the weekend. That's the reality, Mrs. Reardon. It's not a lifestyle choice in the way that was indicated by the tone of the comments from number 10 Downing Street. I will in a second. It's not a lifestyle choice that they'd like a free box of tinned and dry food to top up their adequately stocked pantries. The reality is that people are using food banks because of the cost of living crisis that's facing families across the UK. I will give way to my honourable friend.
Luciana Bird.
Anyway, and I won't seek to intervene on him any further. He's been very generous in giving way. Do you think that, well, we know from questions that were asked just before Christmas that neither the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Chancellor, any minister from DWP, or in fact any minister from the Department for DEFRA, the Department of Environment, had actually visited a food bank? And does my honourable friend agree that had any of these ministers been, including the Prime Minister, then we wouldn't have heard the comments coming out of number 10 as he just outlined?
Kevin Brennan.
Yes, I suspect she's right, Mrs. Reardon, and I'm sure that the Minister has visited a food bank, and he'll tell us that in his remarks at the conclusion. He'll also indicate what kind of an impression it made upon him and what his feelings were on visiting the food bank. Now, government policies such as the welfare rating bill, the VAT hike and the bedroom tax, Mrs. Reardon, are making this crisis worse. And I will in a moment, yes. I hope that the Minister will, in his remarks at the end, distance himself from the comments that we'd heard from Downing Street and acknowledge the impact that government policies are having in making things worse, not better, for hundreds of thousands of families across Wales. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Way. I just think it is important to point out that there's no VAT on food, so therefore the VAT change did not have an effect on the price of food, and I think it is important to remember that point.
Kevin Brennan.
He's absolutely right, and I am aware of that fact, but I think he'll find that families spend their money on other things that do attract VAT, and that has a direct impact upon their disposable income and therefore on their ability to afford to buy food. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Albert Owen.
Grateful to my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate him on securing this important debate. That is the very point. Visitors to food banks in my constituency tell me that because they're paying VAT on other things, particularly on periphery areas on fuel, for instance, that they have less money to spend on fuel, food, and that's the very reason they come into these food banks for the first time. And these are people who are working long hours quite often.
Yes, indeed, and it's a continuing process. We've had the CPI figures released today. I think it's 2.7%, Mrs. Reardon. That's 1.2% above rises in income for people in work. So the impact is happening for everybody, including people in work, as well as those who are out of work. And the VAT impact, as we know, because it's a regressive tax, does hit those on the lowest incomes the most. Also because their marginal propensity to consume is much higher than people on higher incomes. So VAT is particularly a hard tax on those on low incomes. Now, Mrs. Reardon, you'll be aware that 90% of the food in food banks is donated, mainly via public donations to in supermarkets, churches, community centres, schools and others. And I want to pay tribute to the efforts of food banks, often run by the Trussell Trust, including the one in Ely in my constituency, which I've visited. And they're intended as a crisis intervention for families in need. The problem, as I said earlier on, Mrs. Reardon, in response to intervention, is not what they do, but the scale on which they're now having to do it. That food then goes to distribution centres where food bank volunteers gather, weigh and account for and suit the food. And it's only issued to recipients if they have vouchers. And those vouchers are issued by frontline service officers trained in the assessment of need, including, amongst others, Citizens Advice Bureau, Job Centre Plus, GPs, social services, housing officers, and now, as I said earlier on, members of parliaments themselves, and I suspect possibly Welsh Assembly members too. And a voucher gives just over 3 days' worth of food, and typically vouchers are issued in batches of 3. The Trust, as we heard earlier on, now operates 23 food banks across Wales, 9 of which have opened in the last year, and 4 more are expected to open in Wales by Easter of this year. There are over 270 food banks now across the UK. In 2011, 7,173 adults and 4,038 children used a food bank in Wales. And in 2012, 18,000, that's up from 7,000, remember, 18,721, and 10,000 up from 4,000. 10,328 children used a food bank in Wales. So the Trust are now forecasting that the number of people relying on food banks in Wales will rise to 40,000 next year. It collates information about the people that are using food banks, and the consistent main reason, as we've heard already, cited for using a food bank, accounting for perhaps 40 to 45% of usage, is benefit changes and delays in benefit payments. Around a quarter of the usage is accounted for by low-income families, and around a tenth by debt. And as we've heard already, there's been an explosion in food bank usage over the last 2 to 3 years. And I think it is sad but typical that the Prime Minister recently tried to suggest that food banks had expanded by a greater amount under the last government than it has under this government, an abuse of statistics which was skewered by Channel 4's Fact Check feature, and I do recommend it to honourable members. The Trust forecasts that this year's 250,000 people across the UK will have used a food bank. Hundreds of thousands of Welsh families are facing a cost of living crisis that's being made worse by the government's policies, including welfare changes that are likely to make this crisis even worse. And the welfare rating bill, Mrs. Reardon, alone will hit 400,000 low and middle income households in Wales, including 170,000 families in Wales who currently receive working tax credits. It's estimated that 140,000 people in Wales will be worse off by the government's changes to universal credit, and 40,000 people will be hit by the bedroom tax. And I know that honourable members are already getting a lot of traffic in their surgeries about this issue. Now, Mrs. Reardon, the Office of Budget Responsibility has shown that over the period from 2010 to 2013, inflation will have risen by 16%, whereas average earnings will have risen by just half that, 8%. And the TUC estimates that 4-year wage stagnation will cost the average worker £6,000. Wales has some of the highest energy bills across the whole of the UK. More families are having to choose between heating and eating. As I said, the VAT hike alone added around £450 a year to average household bills. Low growth in the economy has created fewer opportunities, and unemployment is forecast to rise in the next 2 years. Public sector job losses are forecast to reach 1 million by 2017. And meanwhile, in April, the government will give over 8,000 millionaires a tax cut of, on average, £107,000. The top 4,000 earners in Wales will benefit from a cut in the additional rate of income tax. So I do have a few questions which I hope the Minister will answer in his response. What does he think best explains this explosion in food bank use in Wales? Is it the cost of living crisis facing Welsh families, or is it the notion that suddenly more people have decided they want a bit of extra food, to quote number 10? On the Politics show this weekend, the Wales Office Minister in the Lords, Baroness Randerson, said that the government is going about reducing the deficit in the fairest possible way. Well, what exactly is fair about the bedroom tax, which will hit 40,000 people in Wales and make it more difficult for people, whilst cutting taxes for millionaires in Wales? What impact does the Minister think the welfare uprating bill will have on the number of people in Wales relying on food banks? Has he made any estimate of that? Does he agree that the growing number of food banks in Wales is a symptom of the cost of living crisis facing Welsh families? Does he accept that the government's failure to get the economy moving is likely to have led to more people relying on food banks? What does he think about the expansion of food bank usage in Wales and across the UK? What does he think that tells us about the success or otherwise of the government's policies? And does he think that the number of people in Wales who rely on food banks is likely to go up or down over the next 2 years? And I hope he's made some sort of estimate of that in preparation for this debate. Now, Mrs. Reardon, we never thought that we'd see the return of the charity handout as a mass means to feed the poor in Wales. And I wonder, is the Minister proud of his government's big society or ashamed of its small-minded demonisation of the poor?